What if the most damning piece of evidence in the death of Marilyn Monroe wasn't an empty pill bottle or a missing diary, but a freshly washed bedsheet? What if the timeline of that fatal night, a timeline recited into history by detectives and biographers, was a carefully constructed fiction, designed not to find the truth, but to bury it forever under the weight of a simple, domestic chore? The world has spent more than half a century dissecting the phantom phone calls to the White House, chasing the ghost of a Kennedy car down a dark Brentwood street, and whispering about mob hits ordered in smoke-filled rooms. They were looking for a conspiracy of giants, of men who moved nations. They were looking in the wrong place. The truth of what happened on the night of August 4, 1962, wasn't born in the halls of power. It was born in the suffocating silence of a single, modest bungalow. And the key to unlocking it wasn't a president, a gangster, or a studio head. It was the housekeeper. Her name was Eunice Murray, an unassuming woman in her 60s, with a gaze that held the placid stillness of a deep, dark lake. She wasn't merely a hired hand who cleaned the floors and made the beds. She was a fixture, a piece of the architecture of Marilyn's final days, placed in the home by the star's own psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, to act as a companion, a guardian, a nursemaid to a fracturing soul. She was the witness, the only witness. And in the hours after Marilyn Monroe's last breath, she became the architect of a lie that has endured for decades. The official story is a masterclass in simplicity, a narrative polished smooth by repetition. At approximately 3 a.m, a sudden, inexplicable feeling of unease compelled Miss Murray to check on her employer. She saw a light still glowing from beneath the bedroom door, a silent beacon in the sleeping house. She knocked. There was no answer. She called out. Only silence replied. The door was locked from the inside, a fact that seemed to her, in that moment, profoundly sinister. A wave of panic, she would later claim. A frantic phone call not to the police, but to Dr. Greenson. He arrived in a hurry, his face a mask of professional concern. Together they peered through the bedroom window, their view partially obscured by the heavy drapery. What they saw was a scene of unnatural stillness. A single, pale arm draped over the edge of the bed, a telephone receiver clutched in a lifeless hand. Greenson, in a desperate act, grabbed a fireplace poker, shattered the window pane, and climbed inside. He confirmed the obvious, the unthinkable. Marilyn Monroe was gone. Only then, at 3:50 in the morning, nearly an hour after the supposed discovery, was a call placed to the Los Angeles Police Department. A clean timeline, a tragic, but straightforward, end. But history is rarely clean, and the truth of that night is anything but straightforward. The story begins to fray the moment you step outside the manicured lawn of 12305 Helena Drive. You just have to listen to the neighbors, the people who lived on that quiet, suburban street, whose own testimonies were largely ignored, dismissed as the ramblings of starstruck locals. One of them, a man named Sergeant Lynn Franklin, who lived only a few doors down, told a story that rips the official narrative to shreds. He reported seeing an ambulance, not at 4 a.m, but hours earlier. He saw it parked outside Marilyn's home, moving with an unnerving stealth. There were no flashing lights, no wailing siren to rupture the peace of the sleeping neighborhood. Just a silent, ghost-like presence at her door, sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night. Hours before Eunice Murray ever claimed to feel that first prickle of concern. This wasn't the aftermath of a discovery. This was the event itself. This single piece of contradictory evidence changes everything. It suggests that the crisis in that house didn't begin at 3 a.m. It began before midnight. It suggests that for nearly 4 hours, a small, select group of people knew Marilyn Monroe was either dying or already dead. And in those 4 unaccounted for hours, a story had to be written, a scene had to be set, and the lead author of that fiction was Eunice Murray. When the first police officer, Sergeant Jack Clemens, arrived on the scene, he was a veteran, a man who had seen death in all its grim and varied forms. He knew, instinctively, when a scene was wrong, and this one was more than wrong. It felt, in his own words, stage-managed. The air was thick with an artificial calm, a rehearsed sorrow that didn't ring true. The key figures, Murray and Greenson, seemed less like frantic discoverers and more like weary actors at the end of a long, exhausting performance. Clemens began his questioning, starting with the housekeeper. Her story was hesitant, peppered with odd inconsistencies even in its first telling. She told him she had grown worried around midnight. Then, moments later, she insisted it was much later, closer to 3. She couldn't seem to recall the exact sequence of events. who she called first, or why there was such a staggering delay in notifying the authorities. It was a story full of holes, a flimsy net that could barely hold the weight of a single, direct question. Her story would change again and again. In 1962, in her official statement, she claimed she found the body after 3 in the morning. But in a taped interview years later with the writer Anthony Scaduto, a stunning admission slipped out. She confessed that Marilyn had died much earlier, that Dr. Greenson had arrived long before his officially stated time, that Robert Kennedy had, in fact, been at the house that very day. Then, realizing what she had said, she panicked. "Oh my God, why did I say that?" she whispered, her voice trembling, before terminating the interview. Her story would morph a third time when she co-authored her own book, a self-serving account that attempted to sand down the jagged edges of her previous statements, presenting herself as a loyal, if somewhat confused, protector of Marilyn's memory. She painted a picture of a calm, normal evening that suddenly turned tragic. But one detail, one action, cuts through all the contradictory words. An action so bizarre, so out of place, that it screams its guilt to the heavens. When Sergeant Clemens walked through the house that morning, the air still thick with unspoken secrets, he made a strange discovery. The washing machine was running. In the guest house where Eunice Murray was staying, a load of laundry was churning away in the pre-dawn hours. He found this odd, but his attention was on the main house, on the body in the bedroom. He didn't press the issue. He should have. Eunice Murray, in the immediate aftermath of discovering the lifeless body of her world-famous employer, the woman she was hired to protect, decided that the most pressing task at hand was the laundry. Think about that. In a house that was about to become the most famous crime scene in the world, amidst the shock and the supposed grief, a washing machine was humming, methodically erasing something from existence. The bed linens from Marilyn Monroe's deathbed were never collected as evidence. They were never examined for traces of fluids, for residue from injections, for anything that might have told a different story from the one being hastily assembled in the living room. They were simply washed. This single act transforms Eunice Murray from a peripheral character, a simple housekeeper, into the central pillar of the entire affair. It is an act of deliberate evidence tampering. It is the act of a conspirator. But was she acting alone, or was she following orders? To answer that, you have to look at the man who put her there in the first place. Dr. Ralph Greenson, a lion of the Beverly Hills psychiatric community, a man whose client list was a who's who of Hollywood royalty. He had been treating Marilyn for years, employing controversial and intensely immersive techniques. He had become more than a doctor. He was a director, attempting to script every scene of her life. He dictated who she could see, what roles she should take, and even who should live with her. He hired Eunice Murray. He placed her inside that house as his eyes and ears. She reported back to him on Marilyn's every mood, every visitor, every phone call. Their relationship was not one of employer and employee. It was one of controller and operative. When Murray found Marilyn's door locked, her first call wasn't to the emergency services that could have saved her life. It was to the man who controlled her life. Greenson's own statements are a labyrinth of contradictions. He claimed to have broken the window with a fireplace poker to gain entry. Yet, initial police reports noted no broken glass inside the room. On the carpet. Later photographs show a single, neat pane of glass removed and set carefully aside. This wasn't the work of a panicked man smashing his way in. It suggests a more methodical entry, perhaps one that had happened hours earlier, when there was still time to change the narrative. And what was the narrative they were so desperate to control? Perhaps it had something to do with the other man whose ghost haunts that night. Peter Lawford, the actor, the socialite, the brother-in-law to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Lawford was Marilyn's direct link to the Kennedys, the facilitator of her disastrous affairs with both John and his brother, Bobby. On that last night, Lawford made a series of increasingly panicked phone calls to Marilyn. He would later tell investigators that he spoke to her around 8 in the evening. She sounded slurred, despondent, and said a strange, slurred goodbye. "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." The line went dead. Lawford claimed he was deeply alarmed. He tried to call back but couldn't get through. He said he was so worried he considered driving over to her house, but he didn't. Instead, he called his agent. He called his lawyer. He made a flurry of calls to everyone except the one person who could have helped: the police. Why? Was it because he knew that a police presence at Marilyn's house that night would unleash a political firestorm that could consume the Kennedy administration? Eunice Murray's carefully constructed timeline provides a convenient buffer. In her version of events, Marilyn was alive and well until the early hours of the morning, long after Lawford's final, disturbing call. It insulates him. It insulates the powerful men he served. It pushes the moment of death deep into the night, into a time when no one could be blamed for not intervening, for not acting on a slurred, cryptic goodbye. It makes her death a lonely, isolated event. It makes it a suicide. But the house on Helena Drive was anything but isolated that night. It was the epicenter of a frantic, hidden storm of activity. And the communication, the desperate calls for help, and the subsequent calls for control were being monitored. Not by the FBI, not by the mob, but by the telephone company itself. A work ticket, filed by a Pacific Bell Telephone Company security supervisor named Carol Wilson, was unearthed decades later. It details a report from a repairman who had been working on the lines in the area. The report stated that on the night of Marilyn's death, technicians had discovered that a special device had been installed on her phone line. It was a sophisticated piece of equipment, one that allowed an outside party to monitor all incoming and outgoing calls in real time. But more than that, it could also be used to interfere with the connection, to cause calls to drop, to prevent calls from going through. It meant someone was not just listening, they were controlling the flow of information from that house. This wasn't a standard wiretap. This was something else. It explains Peter Lawford's claim that he couldn't get back through. It explains the deadline. It also raises a terrifying question. What calls did Marilyn try to make that never went through? Did she try to call an ambulance? A friend? Did she try to call for help, only to find herself utterly, technologically, cut off from the world? The official records of her phone calls from that night are a mess. A tangled web of inconsistencies and missing data. But one person inside that house needed no phone records. One person was a first-hand witness to every call that was made and every call that was received before the line went dead for good. Eunice Murray. She knew. She knew who called. She knew what was said. And she knew why the story had to be changed. Was she a pawn? A simple, elderly woman caught in the gears of a machine far too powerful for her to comprehend. Threatened into silence? Coerced into a lie? This is the most charitable interpretation, the one her defenders cling to. They see a frightened employee, loyal to Dr. Greenson, perhaps terrified by the powerful forces she witnessed descending upon that small house that night. A woman who simply did as she was told, who washed the sheets because a man in a position of authority told her to wash them. But there is another possibility, a darker and more chilling one, that Eunice Murray was not a pawn, but a willing participant, a gatekeeper, a woman placed in that house for a reason, a woman whose primary loyalty was not to the fragile star she cared for, but to the doctor who signed her paychecks, and, by extension, to the powerful interests he was trying to protect. Consider her demeanor. In photographs taken in the days and weeks after Marilyn's death, she doesn't appear shattered by grief. She appears stressed, yes, but also stoic, guarded. In later interviews, she is defensive, her answers clipped and evasive, her eyes constantly shifting, as if searching for the right words, the approved words. This is not the behavior of a simple, grieving woman. This is the behavior of someone keeping a secret, someone who knows their words carry an immense, dangerous weight. She was the fulcrum. Every lie, every inconsistency, every theory about the Kennedys, the mob, or Dr. Greenson, all of it pivots on the testimony of this one woman. Her timeline is the foundation upon which the official story of suicide was built. And if that foundation is a lie, the entire structure collapses. The men who visited that day, the cars that came and went, the first ambulance that arrived in silence and left in failure, all of it was erased by her simple domestic tale of seeing a light under a door. She washed more than the bedsheets that night. She laundered the truth. Let us return to that moment, the axis on which history turned. The small house is no longer quiet. It is a hive of contained chaos. Dr. Greenson is there. His colleague, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, has been summoned. Marilyn's lawyer, Mickey Rudin, is on his way. Peter Lawford is on the phone, a frantic voice from a distant, glittering world. The official story is being constructed, line by line, in the hushed, urgent conversations in the living room. Timelines are being aligned, alibis are being solidified, and through it all, there is a steady, rhythmic, mechanical sound. The churn and slosh of the washing machine in the guest house. It is the soundtrack to the cover-up. It is the sound of evidence being destroyed. One can imagine Eunice Murray, her face impassive, her movements methodical, as she loads the sheets into the machine. The sheets that held the final, intimate secrets of Marilyn Monroe's life. Did they smell of perfume? Of sweat? Of vomit? Of blood? Did she find a scorched indentation from a misplaced cigarette? Or the residue of a substance that was never meant to be found? We will never know, because she washed it all away. She took the most crucial piece of forensic evidence from the scene of the most famous death of the 20th century, and she subjected it to soap and hot water. It is an act of such audacious yet subtle destruction, it almost defies belief. It is the perfect homespun crime. Who, after all, would question a housekeeper for doing the laundry? Witnesses who saw her that morning provided conflicting accounts of her state. Some, like the ambulance driver who eventually transported the body, described her as fluttering and distraught. But Officer Jack Clemens held fast to his initial impression. He saw a woman who was disturbingly, unnaturally calm. A woman who was performing a role. He would later say, "The whole thing was a damn cover-up from the beginning." He felt it in his bones the moment he walked into that house. The scene was too neat. The players were too composed. The story was too simple. It was all wrong. He was the first official presence on the scene, the first man with a badge and a gun to try and make sense of the tragedy. And the first person he spoke to was the housekeeper. As the flashbulbs of the press began to pop outside and the world's media descended on Helena Drive, Sergeant Clemens stood in the quiet of the house, looking at the woman who held all the answers. He saw her near her humming washing machine, a surreal detail in a scene already saturated with unreality. He knew her story didn't add up. He felt the vast, dark weight of the secrets swirling in that room. Secrets he was being actively prevented from uncovering. He looked directly at Eunice Murray, the calm eye of the hurricane, and asked her a simple question, hoping for a sliver of unscripted truth. He asked her what had really happened, who had been there, what she had seen. Her official story, the one about the light under the door, was still hours from being solidified into the historical record. In that moment, there was a flicker of a chance, a brief window where the truth might have escaped. Her reply to the sergeant, a reply that was never logged in the official police report, would be scrubbed from the narrative that was being frantically assembled around them. It was a single, cryptic sentence, a phrase that would haunt Clemens for the rest of his life, a statement that only deepened the mystery and confirmed his darkest suspicions. She looked at him, her gaze steady for the first time, and uttered 6 words that proved the conspiracy was real. She said, "Ask Bobby Kennedy what happened here tonight." 6 words, a ghost of a whisper against the hum of the washing machine. It was not an accusation. It was a redirection, a quiet, chilling signpost pointing towards a level of power so immense, so untouchable, that a lone police sergeant was a gnat to be swatted away. In that moment, Jack Clemens understood. This wasn't a crime scene he was investigating. He had stumbled into the middle of a national security operation. He had been handed a script, and Eunice Murray, the seemingly simple housekeeper, was merely its first narrator. Her statement to him vanished, of course. It never made it into a single official document. It became another phantom, another whisper in the long, dark hallway of the Marilyn Monroe case. But what if Clemens, Murray, and even Dr. Greenson were all playing their parts on the wrong stage? We have been laser-focused on the house, on Helena Drive, on the locked door, the empty pill bottles, the laundered sheets. We've been asking what happened in that room. But what if the most audacious lie of all isn't what happened in the room, but the room itself? What if Marilyn Monroe never died in her own bed? This is where the story fractures, splintering into a far more terrifying reality. Because there are witnesses, suppressed for decades, who tell a different story, not about a quiet death, but a frantic, failed rescue attempt. The first ambulance on the scene, Z3 from the Schaefer Ambulance Company, was not the one that eventually took her body to the morgue. Its driver, Ken Hunter, would later state under oath that when he arrived, he found Marilyn alive, comatose, but alive. He claimed Dr. Greenson was there, and that he, Hunter, was attempting to resuscitate her when Greenson intervened. According to Hunter's shocking testimony, Greenson produced a syringe with a long needle and, bypassing the ribs, injected a substance directly into her heart. A shot of adrenaline, he allegedly claimed, to restart it. But Hunter watched in horror as Marilyn's body violently convulsed, and then went limp. He believed he had not witnessed a rescue, but an execution. An act of medical malpractice so profound it bordered on murder. Is this story credible? It would explain one of the most glaring inconsistencies of the autopsy. The massive concentration of barbiturates in her liver, yet almost no trace of pill residue in her stomach. A direct injection would bypass the digestive system entirely, delivering a fatal dose with terrifying efficiency. The official story of her swallowing 40 to 50 pills was physically, forensically, Almost impossible. But a direct injection? That fits the evidence perfectly. But this theory raises an even darker question. If she was found alive, why all the secrecy? Why the hours-long delay in calling the police? Why not rush her to a hospital? Unless the people in that house were not trying to save her life but trying to manage the circumstances of her death. Trying to erase who had been with her when she lost consciousness. And that brings us to the other nexus of this conspiracy. A place of sun, sand, and secrets. The Santa Monica beach house of Peter Lawford. Lawford, the brother-in-law to the Kennedys. Hollywood royalty, connected to the American political dynasty. His phone calls that night were not just frantic. They were the communications of a panicked fixer. Multiple accounts suggest that on August 4th, Robert Kennedy was not in Northern California as his alibi claimed. He was in Los Angeles, and he had a vicious, final argument with Marilyn that afternoon, likely at Lawford's home. Now, imagine the scenario. An overdose, perhaps accidental, perhaps not, occurs not at Marilyn's house, but at Lawford's, with Robert Kennedy present. The political implications are not just career-ending, they are world-shaking. A potential presidential candidate, the Attorney General of the United States, implicated in the death of the world's most famous movie star, a woman with whom he and his brother were both rumored to be having affairs. The scandal would be apocalyptic. What do? You don't call the police. You call your own people. You orchestrate a solution. You move her. In the dead of night, an unconscious Marilyn Monroe is transported from Lawford's beach house back to her own quiet home in Brentwood. You place her in her own bed, arrange the pill bottles on the nightstand, and then you call her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, the man you trust to manage the scene. The man whose loyalty, as we've established, is to you. Now, Eunice Murray's bizarre behavior, her calm demeanor, her washing of the sheets, all makes a terrifying new kind of sense. She wasn't destroying evidence of a suicide. She was helping to stage one. The scene wasn't a cover-up. It was a construction site. Dr. Greenson and Eunice Murray weren't erasing clues. They were building a new reality, brick by painstaking brick. They were the final stage crew, ensuring the set was perfect for the story the world was about to be told. The story of a lonely, depressed movie star who took her own life. A tragedy, yes, but a simple, self-contained one. But why go to such extraordinary, terrifying lengths? Because what Marilyn Monroe possessed was far more dangerous than scandalous love letters. It was a little red diary. In its pages, she didn't just document her affairs. She documented the pillow talk. Details of conversations with Jack and Bobby Kennedy about national security, the CIA, the Mafia, Cuba. She had become an accidental repository for state secrets. She was no longer a jilted lover to be managed. She was a security threat to be neutralized. And when a threat of that magnitude emerges, the system protects itself. The story was set, and every institution fell in line. The LAPD's investigation was shut down from above. The coroner, Thomas Noguchi, was pressured into his probable suicide ruling, a verdict he would question for the rest of his life. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was annihilated. In the end, the world's most luminous star was extinguished, not by a handful of pills, but by the crushing weight of power. She wasn't a suicide. She was a casualty of an undeclared war fought in the shadows of power, from the White House to the Hollywood Hills. Her death became the ultimate special effect, a masterful illusion designed to protect the men who believed they were untouchable. We are left with a ghost story, a constellation of maybes and what-ifs. The official narrative is a lie, but the absolute truth may be forever lost, buried with the men and women who chose silence over justice. What we know for certain is that on the night of August 4th, 1962, the truth was taken from a bedroom on Helena Drive, and a legend was locked inside its place. Marilyn Monroe didn't just die, she was disappeared. The powerful write history, but the truth leaves behind whispers. We follow those whispers down the darkest corridors of Hollywood's past. To make sure you never miss an investigation, subscribe to Boulevard_of_Monroe. The ghosts are